statement that I just showed you. Here is one example, thank you very much. Here is one example of the temperature evolution over the last 1,200 years. And it's one thing that is often forgotten, that this evolution of the temperature in the last 1,200 years is based really on many different independent sources of evidence here, highlighted as the fact of many different tree-ring analyses by different individuals, physical climate change indicators such as borehole temperatures and direct measurements. So it's clear that there is an adequate representation of a range of results that finally brings us to the assessment and the statements that I've highlighted. Here is the next important statement, which is so relevant for COP15 here in Copenhagen, and that is that most of the observed increase in global average temperature is very likely due to the increase in greenhouse gas concentration. This statement is based on direct observation and their combination with a variety of model simulations and statistical methods. You see, such statements always rest on many pillars, and that is to be appreciated if you go really into the full report. And finally, the last statement, which is important, I think, also for these negotiations here in Copenhagen, is that continued greenhouse gas emissions would induce many changes that would very likely be larger than those observed. Of course, there is a whole body of a chapter in the Working Group 1 contribution, and more elaborated when it comes to impact in the Working Group 2 contributions. Here, just one image as a placeholder for what the future holds in terms of surface temperatures, which highlights very large temperature changes and an amplification of the climate change, especially on the continents where people live and in the high geographical latitudes where ecosystems are highly impacted. Let me come to the conclusions. The combination of observations and paleoclimate information shows unprecedented changes in the climate system, both in amplitude and rate, for hundreds to many thousands of years. Widespread melting of ice margins is observed in Greenland and Antarctica, with implications for sea level rise. I've shown this in the side event on past Tuesday. We don't have time to go into this, but these are very recent observations which will be carefully assessed in Working Group 1 contribution to AR5. Emitted carbon dioxide remains in the atmosphere for thousands of years, causing irreversible changes in the climate and in ocean chemistry. And I mean here all climate variables in the atmosphere and in all the components of the climate system. And finally, this is a quote out of our statement that we posted on the internet on December 4. The IPCC firmly stands behind the conclusions of AR4. I've just shown you very few here in this press conference. The community of researchers, as already mentioned by Dr. Pachauri, and its individuals providing the scientific basis and the procedures of the IPCC assessment. Thank you very much.
Who is responsible for characterizing impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. In the fourth assessment report of the IPCC, we quantified and reported on more than 25,000 observed impacts that have already occurred in the Earth system. A few of these have been benefits, but the vast majority have been negative impacts. And one of the main conclusions from the AR4 analysis was that in the current setting, there are vulnerable sectors and there are vulnerable populations in every region. Vulnerability is concentrated in a few hotspots, but no place is immune, even from the climate changes that have already occurred. When we look at projected impacts moving into the future, they occur in several key areas, a couple of which I want to highlight here. One is water availability. Small change in water resources potentially puts hundreds of millions of people at risk. Very clear indications from the Working Group 1 analysis that water availability will be shifting with increases in some areas and important decreases in other areas. Second key area for concern is extreme events. Extreme events in many different kinds, ranging from severe storms, heat waves, droughts, very sensitive to climate. We've already seen changes in many regions, and the projections are strong for the future. It's also clear that with a relatively modest amount of warming, we'll see decreases in crop production. As warming gets to be larger and larger, the extent of the crop production decreases, becomes larger and larger, with the real risk of malnutrition. There are certainly already hotspots of food insecurity, and the projections are that within the next few decades we could see concentration of really serious food insecurity, particularly in Southern Africa and Southern Asia. There also are really important expensive impacts projected in areas of infrastructure, especially coastal infrastructure, where a modest increase in sea level rise can lead to literally hundreds of billions of losses of investments that have already been made. And then finally, biological diversity is clearly very sensitive to climate change, with projected losses of biodiversity scaling with levels of impacts, but going from a few percent at the lower range of warming we're talking about, up to as much as 30 or more percent in key areas if warming goes on the trajectories at the high end of the range that the IPCC considered. It's really important to remember that vulnerability is not uniformly distributed. There are key vulnerable people and key vulnerable sectors, and that when we talk about the distribution of impacts, they really will be concentrated on the poor, as Dr. Pachauri has said. The final conclusion that I want to emphasize is that it's very clear from the analysis in Working Group 2 that the level of impact scales with the level of emissions, and that important amounts of impacts can be avoided or delayed with investments in adaptation and investments in mitigation. You can see that very clearly in the analysis here, where Working Group 2 looked at the consequences for several key sectors. Shown here are water resources, food availability, and sea level rise with different levels of warming. And the consequence is that for water resources, for example, the number of people at risk decreases by several hundred million if climate change can be moved from the high levels to the lower levels. In terms of food insecurity, we're looking at modest amounts of warming resulting in increases in food availability in some places, but high levels of warming resulting in decreases at all locations throughout the low latitudes. And finally, in terms of extreme events, it's important to remember that the difference between the lower range of warming that we're looking about is a manageable but serious amount of sea level, and when we look at higher levels with certainty that's far from well established, but probably in the middle of the range somewhere, we're looking at long-term commitment of sea level rise of several meters. Long-term is probably several hundred years, but the commitment is nonetheless important. Finally, I just want to close with a couple of quick comments about the IPCC processes. Dr. Pachauri has already indicated how proud we are of the processes that have served the IPCC so well over the last 4 assessment cycles. And I just want to highlight a couple of features of the process that we continue to rely on really heavily. The first is that there's contributions from huge author teams that are selected with a very careful international process. There are 2 stages of carefully monitored international reviews involving, in the AR4, over 90,000 review comments. Author teams need to respond to each one of these review comments, and an independent set of review editors monitors the responses. The final draft has gone through at least 2 reviews that have scrubbed out everything that wasn't consistent with the underlying scientific literature, and has included everything that's been pointed out in the review process. And as Dr. Pachauri says, the final summaries for policymakers are approved word by word, by consensus, by all the world's governments. It's a process of which we're extremely proud, and that we're confident will serve us well in the analysis for the 5th assessment cycle. Thanks very much.